There it's a massive, this is being triggered off by explosions beyond doubt. Explosions so large that they've consumed the entire wing of the Taj Hotel. A massive explosion that seems to be close to destroying one of the most beautiful structure that represents not just the city of Mumbai, the heritage of Mumbai, the spirit of Mumbai. That's going up in smoke even as we speak tonight. Shantanu Pulaskar is our reporter reporting live.
These scenes of the burning Taj Mahal Hotel were on live feed to cable and satellite networks around the world. Many Westerners had heard of the rivalry between India and Pakistan, and may have been aware of the tensions centering on the disputed territory of Kashmir, but the sheer brutality and brazenness of the Mumbai massacre brought the jihad in India to global consciousness as never before. Unfortunately for India, the Mumbai attacks were only unique in terms of the high-profile media coverage accorded to them. The casualty figures, while appalling, were rather standard in the context of the series of Islamic terror attacks in India in the 21st century, and they are dwarfed by the massacres of tens and hundreds of thousands, sometimes in a single day, that pepper the 1,300-year history of Islamic conquest on the Indian subcontinent. Before the Islamic juggernaut burst in from the west, the native religions of these lands were Hinduism, Buddhism, and Sikhism. The jihad against India was extraordinarily brutal, even by Islamic standards. This is because, unlike the so-called people of the book, Christians and Jews, who enjoyed some basic rights as subjected dhimmis, Hindus and Buddhists were considered idolaters, the lowest of the low, worthy only of death. Only 25 years after Muhammad's death, Islamic forces had crushed the Sassanid Persian Empire, and thus brought the spearhead of Islam to the borderlands of India. The first permanent Muslim foothold on the subcontinent was achieved with Muhammad bin Qasim's conquest of Sind in 711 AD. He demolished temples, shattered sculptures, plundered palaces, killed all able-bodied men, and carried their women and children into slavery. For example, it took his army 3 days to slaughter all the inhabitants of the port city of Dabal. But the Arab-Muslim conquest would stall here in the northwestern frontier. By the end of the 10th century, however, newly Islamized Turkic tribes began to expand the Ummah into what is now northwest India proper. Mahmud of Ghazni, who was also known as a Sword of Islam, mounted 17 plundering expeditions between 997 and 1027 AD into North India. Each winter, Mahmud descended into India, filled his treasure chest with spoils, and amused his men with full freedom to pillage and kill. Each spring he returned to his capital richer than before. At Mathura he took from the temple its statues of gold encrusted with precious stones, and emptied its coffers of a vast quantity of gold, silver, and jewelry. He expressed his admiration for the architecture of the great shrine, judged that its duplication would cost 100 million dinars and the labor of 200 years, and then ordered it to be soaked with naphtha and burnt to the ground. 6 years later he sacked another opulent city of northern India, Somnath, killed all its 50,000 inhabitants, and dragged its wealth to Ghazni. In the end, he became perhaps the richest king that history has ever known. A subsequent conqueror, Muhammad Khaliji, had the distinction of single-handedly wiping out the Buddhist culture on the subcontinent by the end of the 12th century. He conquered their stronghold in Bihar, and burned their famous library to the ground, slaughtering thousands of Buddhist monks and destroying dozens of ancient temples in the process. Muslims have done their best to erase any trace of this culture, even as recently as March 2001, when the Taliban destroyed 4 giant statues of Buddha in Bamiyan, Afghanistan. Khaliji's brutality also incited the first case of Jauhar in India. Jauhar is a desperate act of mass self-immolation. When Khaliji besieged the city of Chittor, the Hindu inhabitants realized their cause was hopeless. As the men rode off to certain death in battle, the women and children burned themselves alive, rather than suffer the dishonor of being killed or enslaved by the conquerors. Another Turkic Muslim warlord, Timur, known as Tamerlane in the West, crossed the Indus River in 1398 and eventually captured the capital of Delhi. Timur explains the motivation for his conquest in his personal memoirs. About this time there arose in my heart the desire to lead an expedition against the infidels, and to become a Ghazi, for it had reached my ears that the slayer of infidels is a Ghazi, and if he is slain he becomes a martyr. It was on this account that I formed this resolution, but I was undetermined in my mind whether I should direct my expedition against the infidels of China or against the infidels and polytheists of India. In this matter I sought an omen from the Quran, and the verse I opened upon was this: O Prophet, make war upon infidels and unbelievers, and treat them with severity. My great officers told me that the inhabitants of Hindustan were infidels and unbelievers. In obedience to the order of Almighty Allah, I determined on an expedition against them. Later, he describes the sack of Delhi in his own words. In a short space of time, all the people in the fort were put to the sword, and in the course of 1 hour the heads of 10,000 infidels were cut off. The sword of Islam was washed in the blood of the infidels, and all the goods and effects, the treasure and the grain, which for many a long year had been stored in the fort, became the spoil of my soldiers. They set fire to the houses and reduced them to ashes, and they razed the buildings and the fort to the ground. All these infidel Hindus were slain, their women and children, and their property and goods became the spoil of the victors. I proclaimed throughout the camp that every man who had infidel prisoners should put them to death, and whoever neglected to do so should himself be executed, and his property given to the informer. When this order became known to the Ghazis of Islam, they drew their swords and put their prisoners to death. 100,000 infidels, impious idolaters, were on that day slain. On the great day of battle, these 100,000 prisoners could not be left with the baggage, and it would be entirely opposed to the rules of war to set these idolaters and enemies of Islam at liberty. No other course remained but that of making them all food for the sword. By the early 1500s, the mantle of Islamic power in India had passed to the first Mughal emperor, Babar. Over the next centuries, the Mughal Empire would expand to occupy nearly the entire Indian subcontinent. During the Mughal period, outright slaughters and enslavements were less common, but the regime provided many incentives to convert to Islam by means of degrading dhimmi laws and burdensome jizya taxes. So far as the Hindus were concerned, there was no improvement either in their material and moral conditions or in their relations with the Muslims. With the sole exception of Akbar, who sought to conciliate the Hindus by removing some of their glaring evils to which they were subjected, almost all other Mughal emperors were notorious for their religious bigotry. The Muslim law, which imposed many disabilities and indignities upon the Hindus, and thereby definitely gave them an inferior social and political status as compared to the Muslims, was followed by these Mughal emperors with as much zeal as was displayed by their predecessors. The climax was reached during the reign of Aurangzeb, who deliberately pursued the policy of destroying and desecrating Hindu temples and idols with a thoroughness unknown before or since. Based on Muslim chronicles and demographic calculations, Indian historian K.S. Lal has estimated that the Hindu population of India decreased by 80 million during the millennium of Islamic rule. Yet despite a deliberate policy of genocide and conversion over the 1,000 years of partial or complete Muslim rule, the majority of the population miraculously retained their Hindu religion as modernity dawned on the subcontinent. In the next episode, we will explore the continuing Islamic efforts to reconquer India in the modern era.